sure you've all heard or seen the phrases that go along with siblings. Right? I'm the oldest. I make the rules. Or I'm in the middle. I'm the reason we got the rules. Or I'm the youngest. Those rules don't apply to me. So as the fourth child in six, these sayings only slightly apply to me. Most of the rules were made long before I was even born. The thing, though, is that I was the first boy, and my younger brother is the last of us. So I was kind of the first, the middle, and the youngest for a while, doing all three. So half the rules, they didn't really matter to me or to my little brother. I didn't have to be told not to steal my sister's shoes. I didn't have to worry about being yelled at for playing with my mother's makeup. It's not something I did. But some of the rules that we had made were made because of me. One of these, I'll never forget how this one happened. In my front yard out in Colorado, we had this tree, this really awesome climbing tree. It had good branches all the way up to the top. So as a 5-year-old, I sat there and I looked at that tree and I said to myself, I'm going to climb that thing all the way to the top. All the way to the top. Well, I started off and it was kind of hard because 5-year-old little me is barely as big as the branches around. But as I got to the middle, it got a little bit easier. I could grab hold of the branches nicely. I could fit through little gaps that nobody else really could. But it started to get hard again as I got closer to the top because the branches got smaller and they were more flimsy. And eventually, I slipped. I only felt like a foot or so, but to a 5-year-old, that's kind of scary. But it was also embarrassing because I'm the boy. I should be able to do this stuff. So I look around real quick, make sure nobody's watching, and I look at the ground. I see the ground and it's so far away. And the little 5-year-old in me was just like freezing right there on the tree, panicking, afraid.
Keep going.
Keep talking.
Keep talking.
Keep talking.
Let's do it.
Test 1, 2.
I think you have to swallow it. I may or may not have swallowed that before.
Right. So I've never had to use one of these before. This is
Still can't hear you.
Don't worry.
You still can't hear me? How about now? This work?
Get 6 mics on you. 1 more.
Okay. Does that one work?
Okay. Is that better than that? Okay.
Okay.
Somebody said no. Sorry.
All right. So I'm sitting there in this tree, 5-year-old, freaking out just a little bit. So I start crying out for help. And my oldest sister hears me. She heard me pretty quick. She comes running as fast as she can. But to a 5-year-old, a minute can feel like a year, especially when you're scared. So I'm sitting in the tree and I see my sister pelting down the hill up to the tree. And she's scrambling up. She's been climbing for years, so she knows exactly where to go to get up. But I'm still just freaking out. I'm terrified. It didn't take very long for my sister to get up to me, and when she did, she had me climb on her back, and she climbed me all the way back down the tree. After that, of course, my family had to make a new rule. You couldn't climb the tree by yourself if you were younger than 10. But you couldn't climb the tree at all if you were younger than 6. I listened to my little brother came along, and he didn't care. He just climbed that tree anyway. The point of this story is that I was crying out for help, and then I was answered. You guys are going through the story, and this week it's all about Moses and the 10 plagues. The whole point point of this entire section is that God's people are crying out for help, and then he rescued them. I'm going to briefly talk through Exodus chapters 1 through 12, explaining a few thoughts and describing some of the background knowledge of what happened. I'm going to stop right after the Passover. And when I say that, I mean literally. As soon as Passover's done, but I'd like you guys all to keep that one theme in this section as I'm talking. God is delivering his people. I'd like you to relate that to the whole story. That God answered our cries for help when he sent Jesus to die on the cross. And that the rest of this story is still playing out. Let's jump into it. The Israelites were in Egypt for 400 years. I'll give you a picture of what this means. The United States is 239 years old this year. It's a little under half of how long the Israelites were in Egypt. And in that 400 years, the Egyptians forgot who the Israelites were, who the Hebrews were. They forgot about the agreement between Pharaoh and Joseph. So far were their minds from those events that they enslaved the Hebrews. Now, I want to give you an idea of what this would look like to us in a personal way. So let's rewrite history for a couple of minutes. Let's go back in time and take all of the Native American tribes, but remove the fact that they're tribes, make them all one nation, one ruler for the entire United States region. So when America is discovered, it's already a sovereign nation. It's already strong enough to withstand war against the Europeans. And so instead of becoming British colonies and then the United States, the only reason any other nationality exists is because they're refugees. Probably because of all the wars that existed between England and France and Spain. These refugees would be just like the Israelites, set on their own reservation, somewhere where they could live, where they could farm, where they could grow and vent, where they could thrive as a community. Let's fast forward about 239 years where we would be today. And let's just imagine that those refugees, in that time, their population grew to about half the size of all the people in North America. And the Native Americans, being the sovereign nation there, begin to become afraid that perhaps these refugees will take them over. So these people are enslaved. These people, remember in this analogy, these people are us. This is us being enslaved in our own homes. Us being enslaved in our own neighborhoods. This is us being enslaved in our own country. But I want you to understand, this is what it was to the Israelites in Egypt. They were there for 400 years. They had established deep, deep roots in that community. And then they were enslaved. Enslaved because of fear. But the Israelites were God's chosen people. They were set aside for the special purpose of bringing salvation to the world. God would not leave them enslaved. He would deliver them out of Egypt. Now, in order to free a slave, which the Israelites were, the slave owner has to be the one to release them. And this is just how slavery worked, both in the ancient times and closer to our modern times. If someone wanted to purchase a slave, the owner had to agree to it. They couldn't just come up, hand them money, and take the slave. So God had to send someone who would purchase his people from Egypt. He had to send someone who would redeem his people from Egypt. And this man, he would be a messenger of God. He would be a native to Egypt. He would be a member of the royal family. And yet he would be a Hebrew himself. One of the slaves. This man's Moses. I really love Moses. He's probably one of my favorite people in all the Bible. I could probably talk about him for hours. I mean, he was so close to God that he physically saw God's glory as he passed by. He was so close to God that the Israelites described him as literally glowing with God's power. He was so close to God that only God knew where he was buried. Like I said, I could go on about Moses for hours, but for this message, I'm just going to talk about how he came to lead the Israelites. When Moses was considered the son of Pharaoh's wife, when she found him in the river and adopted him, he literally became the heir to the throne. He was a member of the royal family. In the Egyptian line of theology, he was related to the gods. But Moses rejected that. He rejected the wealth and the power and the influence. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us that according to the Hebrews' tradition, even at a very young age, Moses knew that he was to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. He says that as a toddler, Moses threw down Pharaoh's crown and trampled on it. But even so, he lived in the palace as Egyptian royalty for his entire life. Now what this would mean, we wouldn't typically understand this in our world where we can pick and choose what we learn and pursue different fields of study. But the royalty, all of the royal family, had to receive the same education. They had to be taught everything on how to rule a nation and how to do it effectively. So Moses was well educated in Egyptian military strategy. He was well educated in the political nuances of the ancient times. He was well educated in public speaking. He knew how to do it, even if he couldn't actually do it. Moses even had education in the religious affairs of Egypt. He could have been a priest for the Egyptian gods. So even to the Egyptians, who Moses did not follow through with his heritage on, Moses is no small man. As far as the Jewish traditions indicate, it still took Moses 40 years to finally do something about the Israelites' captivity. And what he does is he sees a Hebrew man who's being beaten by an Egyptian. He kills the Egyptian to rescue the Hebrew. Of course, in a Hebrew tradition, it was at this point that Moses thinks, this is where I'm going to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. This is where I'm going to save God's people. And he thinks he's going to do it by military might. He thinks the Hebrews will join him and fight to overthrow Egypt. But the Hebrew man didn't join Moses. In fact, the next time Moses encountered a Hebrew, he was beating another Hebrew. When Moses tries to stop him, they confront him about killing the Egyptian. And Moses realizes his mistake at that point. That his own people are not actually going to join him. That he's just killed an Egyptian for nothing. And so he runs, seeking a life of exile. Moses left, and he believed that he had failed his greatest purpose. He believed that he had failed to free God's people, which was what he thought his entire existence was meant to be. For another 40 years, Moses would live as an exile with those who would take him in after his crime in Egypt. In those 40 years, Moses would wander around as a shepherd, believing that he had failed, believing that he wasn't actually meant to lead the Hebrews out of Egypt. For 40 long years, Moses would become older and wiser, and he would eventually come to know what God's true plan was for him in Israel. So when Moses meets God, it's through a burning bush. And we like to imagine, perhaps, that Moses as a shepherd is chasing after a sheep, and he stumbles upon a cave or a hillside where the burning bush is just sitting there burning. The reality would probably be a little bit different. See, in that region, it's not uncommon for bushes to catch fire, spontaneously combusting, so to speak. Moses probably would have seen 4 or 5 bushes burning in a week, at least. So what catches his attention is that, well, I don't know if any of you have tried to burn a bush before, but they burn fast. It would have taken about a minute at the most for a bush to just be gone. But this bush wasn't burning up. Fire wasn't going out quickly. Moses, of course, notices this, and anyone would be curious if they see one bush dying really fast and this other bush just sitting there on fire. Pharaoh suspected that this bush didn't die because this bush was being burned by God's Spirit. So when Moses gets close to this bush, God speaks to him. It's here that God tells Moses his great plan for the Hebrews, to be brought out of Egypt. It's here that God tells Moses that Moses really is the man that he wants to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. But this is also where Moses faces his first fear and tries to back out. And you have to remember, Moses was highly trained as an Egyptian warrior. He could speak to the public. He could fight well because of the military. He could organize and lead a nation. And now, thanks to his life in the desert wilderness, he knew how to do all of these things without Egypt and without the Nile River. But Moses is still reluctant. And it's probably because he still remembers that first disastrous attempt. But God gives Moses his authority. God, whose name is I am that I am. And when Moses tries to excuse himself, he does it by asking God to find someone better suited. Better suited because as an exile, Moses' word would have little effect on its own. And he asked for someone who's better at speaking, because Moses couldn't speak well. He knew how, but that didn't overcome his natural barriers. Because of these two things, Moses' confidence in speaking eloquently, either to the Pharaoh or to the Hebrew people, was very low. He didn't think he could convince anyone to follow him. But God grants Moses only the speaker, and insists that Moses be the spokesman. God gave Moses his power through the shepherd's staff, and armed with God's power, and his brother Aaron as his speaker, Moses set out to Egypt to confront Pharaoh and release the Hebrews. Now, the Pharaoh had changed since Moses had run away, but both were cruel men. They both hated the Hebrews, and they were both stubborn. But since the knowledge of Joseph and his deeds for Egypt had long been forgotten, it's no surprise that when Moses asks the Pharaoh to release the Hebrews just to worship God for a day or two, Pharaoh says, I don't know your God. Let the Hebrews keep working. And thus begins God's work in releasing the Hebrews. Moses' first appeal to Pharaoh included the sign of his staff turning into a snake, which was to represent that there was indeed power behind his request. But Pharaoh's magicians could do the same thing. And so Pharaoh didn't care. The snake was nothing more than a small demonstration, though. Because what God would do next would attack the very heart of the Egyptians. It would be attacking Egypt's gods directly. Now, the gods attacked by the plagues were Khnum, the guardian of the Nile source; Hapi, the spirit of life of the Nile River; Osiris, the life of the land; Heqet, the goddess of fertility; Seth, the god of earth; Utashit, the god of flies; Ptah, Anubis, Hathor, Ammon, the gods associated with cows and bulls; Sekhmet, the goddess of epidemics; Serapis, Imhotep, the gods of healing; Nut, the god of the sky; Isis and Seth, gods of agriculture; Shu, the god of the atmosphere; Serapia, the protector from locusts; Ra, Amun-Ra, Aten, Atum, and Horus, the gods of the sun; Thoth, the moon god; and even Pharaoh himself, whom the people thought was a god. But even with their entire pantheon lying in ruins at Moses' feet, Pharaoh refused to let the Hebrews go. Now, the first of these plagues came when God told Moses to strike the water of the Nile River with Pharaoh and all his officials present. Now, the Nile was the main source of water for miles in all directions. By the water of the Nile, crops grew, livestock were cared for, people drank and bathed. But you can't do any of these things with blood. And that's what happened to the river. When it became blood, nobody could drink it. When it became blood, no one could bathe. When it became blood, crops began to die. The livestock began to die. They couldn't do anything with the river. But unfortunately, Pharaoh's magicians could do the same thing. They could turn water into blood. And so Pharaoh didn't care. And he refused to let the Hebrews leave. So then God tells Moses to ask Pharaoh to release the Hebrews and provide him a warning. If he didn't, frogs would envelop the entire country. I want you to imagine that for a second. Frogs jumping all around the city, swarming every street. Imagine the frogs jumping this way. Frogs sitting in your living room, climbing out of your fireplace. Frogs jumping into and out of your tubs and toilets. Frogs sleeping in your beds. Frogs jumping out of your clothes drawers. Frogs living in your kitchen, popping out of your ovens and sitting on your food. This is what Moses is threatening, that the frogs will literally be everywhere. But the magicians could bring frogs as well, so Moses didn't care. He convinces Moses to get rid of the frogs, and then he'll let the Hebrews go. But as soon as the frogs are gone, Pharaoh's like, oh, never mind, I'll keep them right there. So this time, God tells Moses to strike the ground with his staff, summoning gnats like you wouldn't believe. Imagine fruit flies for a moment, and you know how they love that rotten fruit that's sitting on your counter. Or imagine these swarms of mosquitoes that will follow you around when you go fishing. Those by themselves are really, really irritating. But imagine that to a level where there is a personal swarm for every person and every animal. These gnats are just following everything. Can you imagine how irritating that would be? If you just can't get away from these bugs. They're getting everything. This is the first of the signs that the magicians can't copy. But even so, Pharaoh doesn't care. So God has Moses up the ante by bringing flies into it. So there's flies now and gnats. Too many bugs, if you ask me. But this is where the story starts to get really good. You see, up to this point, the Hebrews had to deal with all of the plagues, same as the Egyptians. When the river returned to blood, they had to deal with it. When the frogs showed up, they had to deal with it. When the gnats showed up, they had to deal with it. But now, just so that Pharaoh knows that God is truly serious, that he's making a distinction between who Egypt is and who his people are, he has Moses tell Pharaoh that the Hebrews aren't going to be bothered by these flies. They'll ignore Goshen, part of Egypt where the Hebrews lived. And Pharaoh, of course, irritated by the bugs, tells Moses that the Hebrews can go have their festival with God. But as soon as the bugs are all gone, as soon as they've flown away, Pharaoh changes his mind again. Can you imagine how frustrated Moses must be by now? How frustrated the Hebrews are getting? But Pharaoh's still not releasing it. So Moses warns Pharaoh that his stubbornness will bring about the death of all his livestock. The only livestock that would survive from being in the Hebrews' land. But Pharaoh, of course, refuses, and then all the horses died. And all the donkeys died. And all the camels, all the cattle, all the sheep, and all the goats, everything that they could use for trade and for food, died. Except for those that belonged to the Hebrews. Now by now, surely the people of Egypt are getting tired of this bad luck that's running across them. By now, surely the advisors of Pharaoh are like, man, you got to get rid of these Hebrews, they're bad news. By now, surely Pharaoh would humble himself before the God of the Hebrews and just let them worship. But no, Pharaoh wouldn't let them go. So Moses takes the ash of the furnace in his hand, and he goes and he throws it into the air in front of Pharaoh. And all of the land was covered in a layer of dust, which spun boils on every single person, every single animal in Egypt, except for the Hebrews. These boils were so painful that now the Egyptian magicians couldn't even stand to come before Moses. But Pharaoh's heart, as hard as it was, still refused. So Moses then warns Pharaoh and all his officials, get everyone inside. Get everyone inside so they will be safe. Because now God is going to bring about a plague that will show that there is no other God like him. By now, of course, the officials know this guy means business. So some of them take their friends and their family and their slaves and bring them all inside. But the ones who were still foolish and still had hard hearts didn't care. When the plague came, it hit as a storm that was greater than any that had ever hit Egypt before. Hail fell from the sky and killed anyone and anything that was still outside. Thunder rumbled and lightning struck the earth. The trees were stripped bare and the crops were beaten down. The people and animals were killed. But the Israelites felt nothing of the storm because it passed right over Goshen and didn't touch them. This time, it seemed that Pharaoh might actually let the Hebrews go. He even confessed that he was sinning against the God of the Hebrews. But as soon as Moses ended the storm, Pharaoh changed his mind again and demanded that the Hebrews stay. By now, Moses is surely getting frustrated with Pharaoh's stubbornness. He warns again what the plague will be. Locusts coming to finish off anything that the hail had left alive. So many locusts, in fact, that the ground would not be visible. So many locusts that not even the trees could survive. This time, all of Pharaoh's officials begged him to let the Hebrews go, pointing out that Egypt is on the brink of utter ruin, and if anything else happens, they might not even be able to come back. Pharaoh's heart, as hard as ever, refused to let the Hebrews go. So Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and darkness fell upon Egypt. It was a darkness so dark that it could be felt. Can you imagine that for a second? Darkness so dark that you can feel it? That's pretty dark. This darkness was so heavy that for 3 days, nobody in Egypt could even move. So dark that they could not move. It's kind of scary if you think about it. But the Hebrews, they didn't have to worry about the darkness. It skipped right over Goshen, just like the rest of these plagues. When darkness lifted, Pharaoh summoned Moses to him. He said that the Hebrews could go as long as they left their livestock behind. Moses, of course, refuses because the Hebrews need their livestock. One, to worship God, two, to survive. So Pharaoh refuses again, and this time he declares that next time he sees Moses, Moses will die. There's one plague left that Egypt needed to feel. It was the heaviest and the greatest of all plagues. This plague was the death of the firstborn. This is the only plague that God doesn't let Moses instigate. All of the others, Moses had to strike the ground or throw dust in the air or put his hand over the waters. But this one, Moses had to hide with the rest of the Hebrews and just wait. This plague, which was the angel of death, would move swiftly through all of Egypt and take the lives of all firstborn people and all of the firstborn livestock. It didn't matter whether it was a slave or a ruler, the firstborn would die. But as long as the Hebrews obeyed the Passover, they would be passed over. This Passover is the one thing that stands between Israel and Egypt. Moses and all the Israelites are instructed to take an unblemished year-old lamb for each family and care for it for 4 days. At the end of the 4th day, they would eat this lamb and put its blood on the doorposts and the door frame. When the lamb was eaten, there should be none left over, and anything that was left had to be burned. The rest of their meal would have to consist of bitter herbs and unleavened bread. Bread that didn't have time to be cooked properly. And they were told to eat in haste and to be ready to leave at any minute. Because as soon as the plague was done, they would have to run. This meal was to be called the Lord's Passover. And every year, it was remembered to celebrate this night. Every year, it marked the beginning of the new Hebrew calendar. So that night, as the Hebrews ate, the angel of death would swoop through the city, and the firstborn of every family would die. The grief of every family in Egypt would be so great that a wail would come up out of Egypt, like none that would ever be heard before or again. It happened as God had said. And Pharaoh finally let the Hebrews go in his grief. Before his mind could change again, the Hebrews were gone. And they began their journey east. And they began their great exodus.